Hello, and welcome to Science with Mr. Morgan. In today's episode, we're going to talk about mutations and genetic disorders. First up, let's talk about mutations specifically. So, what is a mutation? It's a permanent change in the sequence of DNA. Once DNA has a mutation, that mutation will be copied each time the DNA replicates. So what are the effects of these mutations? Are they mutants like X-Men? Not quite. Some mutations cause no effect. It doesn't negatively or positively impact the organism. Some mutations can cause proteins to be made incorrectly, which affects how it works. And usually the loss of a protein function is detrimental to the organism, so this would be a detrimental effect. Mutations can cause changes that end up being beneficial for the organism, though. For example, like a mutation that allows an organism to blend in better in their environment. Now, let's look at some different types of mutations. The first one we're going to talk about is called point mutations. And point mutations impact a single gene, or a single point, which is where they get their name from. One type of point mutation is a deletion, and this is the deletion of a single base in the DNA. Even though it's a single base, this can cause huge effects on the organism by potentially causing a frameshift mutation. And in this particular case, a frameshift mutation is the deletion of one or more nucleotides that changes the reading frame of the genetic material. Another type of point mutation is an insertion, and this is the addition of a single base, whereas the last one was a deletion. Just like deletions, insertions can cause huge effects on the organism by potentially causing a frameshift mutation. In this case, however, the frameshift mutation is the insertion of one or more nucleotides that changes the reading frame of the genetic material. Next up, let's look at chromosomal mutations. These are generally fairly large mutations that may affect many genes at once. One type of chromosomal mutation is known as deletions. This is where a segment of DNA is lost, aka deleted, so there is a missing segment in the chromosome itself. And with this, it typically results in many genes being missing. The next type of chromosomal mutation that we're going to talk about is duplication. This is where a segment of DNA is repeated so the chromosome is longer, which usually results in multiple copies of genes within the chromosome. Another type is inversion, and this is where a segment of DNA is flipped and then reattached to the same chromosome. Next up, insertion. This is where a segment of DNA from one chromosome is added or inserted to another unrelated chromosome. The final type that we're going to briefly touch on is translocation. And this is where two segments from different chromosomes change positions. Now, so far we've talked about a lot of different types of mutations, but what causes them? Many mutations are not caused by errors in replication. Instead, these can be spontaneous, or they can be caused by mutagens in the environment. So what are mutagens? Well, this is any factor in the environment, like chemicals or radiations, that cause mutations. Sometimes mutagens can cause cancer due to the genes being disrupted, which can cause cells to continually divide. Speaking of cancer, let's now talk a little bit about genetic disorders. Many genetic disorders are caused by mutations in one or a few genes, but can also be caused by chromosomal mutations. Some genetic disorders are X-linked or Y-linked, aka sex-linked, while others are carried on one of the other 22 pairs of chromosomes, aka autosomal. Some genetic disorders are due to new mutations, while other genetic disorders are inherited from parents. So first, let's take a look at autosomal recessive disorders. These are genetic disorders that are caused by recessive alleles of a single gene on an autosome. And one specific example of an autosomal recessive disorder is Tay-Sachs disease. Individuals that are affected with Tay-Sachs do not live to adulthood, which means that the gene is not passed from an affected individual to its offspring, because they don't have offspring. If a person is a carrier for Tay-Sachs, they are not affected. Now, another example of an autosomal recessive disorder is cystic fibrosis. Individuals that are affected with cystic fibrosis have excessively thick mucus in their lungs, which makes it hard to breathe. Just like with Tay-Sachs, though, carriers are not affected. Next up, let's talk about autosomal dominant disorders. Before it was autosomal recessive, now it's autosomal dominant. And these are genetic disorders that are caused by the dominant allele of a single gene on an autosome. Since it's a dominant trait, a child only needs to inherit one dominant allele to have the disease. A specific example of an autosomal dominant disorder is Huntington's disease. This disease causes brain cells to break down, which leads to muscle spasms and personality changes. Symptoms of Huntington's do not typically become apparent until the individual is middle-aged, and unless they undergo genetic testing, most people don't know they have it until symptoms arise. This specific onset of symptoms is not common for most genetic disorders. If a parent has Huntington's disease, the child has a 50% chance of having it as well because it is autosomal dominant. Now that we've looked at autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive disorders, let's talk about chromosomal disorders. One way that chromosomal disorders occur is when an individual is born with extra chromosomes. Now, typically, extra chromosomes are fatal for embryos as they develop. However, chromosome 21 and sex chromosomes can be the exception to this. When an individual has an extra chromosome, number 21, they have what is known as Down syndrome. This extra copy of chromosome 21 leads to 47 chromosomes total instead of 46, and this extra chromosome comes from one of the parents. Now, another name for this is trisomy 21. So what does trisomy mean? All the word trisomy means is that there are 3 pairs of the same chromosome instead of 2. Another example of a chromosomal disorder with extra chromosomes is Klinefelter syndrome. And with Klinefelter syndrome, males inherit an extra X chromosome, which leads to an XXY genotype, while females inherit an extra chromosome, which leads to an XXX genotype. And each of these variations have 47 chromosomes total. Now, aside from extra chromosomes, chromosomal disorders can also come from damaged chromosomes. One example of this is Cre-Du-Chat's syndrome, otherwise known as cat's cry syndrome. And with this, a tiny portion of chromosome 5 is missing. Ultimately, the infant's cry ends up resembling a cat's cry, which is where it gets its name from. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. Until next time.